This is the Horizon Hobby Convergence VTOL. What makes it a VTOL is that it can move its main propellers forward to transition from hovering flight into forward flight using two servos embedded in the motor pods. It uses counter-rotating propellers to make sure that it doesn't turn to one side from the torque. The torque cancels it out as they spin in opposite directions. In the rear of the aircraft, there's a third propeller. This is only used in hover mode, and it's used to counterbalance the lift from the main propellers being forward of the center of gravity. As you can see from the rear of the aircraft, the propeller is not perfectly sunk into the body of the aircraft. I do wish this was the case, because it would provide better drag coefficients. You'll notice that there's no rudder control surfaces on this plane. To get it to turn as if it was a rudder while it's in hover mode, it tilts the main rotors on opposite axis. This creates a moment of inertia, which tilts the plane just like a helicopter's tail rotor would. In forward flight, it does the same thing by adjusting the power, and this is called differential thrust, by adjusting the power to one side of the plane or the other. This gives you control over the plane without having to have proper traditional control surfaces on your rudder. During forward flight, the rear lift motor is not used. During forward flight, the servo motors are used to tilt and thrust vector, as it's called, the main propellers. This creates a rolling moment of inertia, which is combined with these control surfaces here. This creates a very agile aircraft, as it probably didn't actually need the motors to be tilting and vectoring its thrust. On the nose of the aircraft, there's an FPV camera port and a handy station for your FPV radio to mount right there, the antenna slotting through this hole here. This cover goes back in place, and there is an air vent in the front with an exhaust in the back. Additional exhaust is also drawn through here. I noticed some exposed contacts on the three main wires going to the lift motor. I'll need to remedy this. This aircraft was supposed to use a Spectrum radio. It already had a radio receiver built in, and I was planning on using this Spectrum DXE. However, the manual did a terrible job explaining how to reprogram the radio, and I ended up giving up and replacing it with my own radio system, an AT9S Pro from RadioLink. Here's the receiver. To get into the aircraft avionics bay, you first have to go to the bottom of the aircraft. You then go and undo this single bolt here, making sure to support the bottom of the aircraft so you don't damage the rudder fins. Once you undo that bolt, you'll be able to take the avionics bay door off. This is where the FPV camera would mount. Make sure you put the screw aside in a safe place so you don't lose it. Inside the avionics bay, you'll see two units. This is the radio receiver unit. This is a Spectrum FPV micro unit, and it connects to this here, which is the flight controller. This calculates the balance and throttle inputs for each of the motors, as well as translates traditional radio signals into multi-rotor flight modes. You'll see the servo connectors for the ESCs, as well as the power connectors. Since we're not using this radio unit anymore, we're going to remove it. This is a fairly small unit, and it uses a serial bus connector, which is why it only has one cable going to the flight controller. You'll notice it's a double antenna arrangement. However, if they placed the antennas at a 90-degree angle like this, it would have gotten better signal. But that's irrelevant. Next, I consulted the manual. I wanted to find what settings I would need to program into my own radio. It recommended 25% exponential, and that was pretty easy to achieve. I was then treating the aircraft as if it was a, quote, plug and play, end quote, aircraft. This is when you plug your own electronics into it. To do this, I went further into the manual and figured out what channels got plugged into what ports on the flight controller. I then collected servo connectors and put the radio into diagnostic mode to make sure that I had all the channels right. The channels were mislabeled on the instruction manual, saying that throttle would have been channel 1. However, it's not. It's channel 3. I was able to connect them using just basic test and error to figure out which cable went where. It was pretty easy. You just plug in your throttle, aileron, elevator, and rudder, and then you plug in two auxiliary channels. One is the gear switch, and the other is a rate switch for balance mode. I actually had a ton of difficulty trying to get this avionics bay to play nicely with this. It is a fairly big radio receiver unit, and there was a lot of extra cable that I didn't need. However, if you shove it down hard enough, just like your emotions, it shouldn't come back up. Definitely won't happen. I then replaced the screw, and just for some extra peace of mind, I put a few extra pieces of tape. I then wanted to test my setup. It's always a very, very good idea, I would say almost mandatory, to take the propellers off the plane when you're testing it. Otherwise, you might have quite the catastrophe on your hands. I also took the rear propeller off. Now, this makes it pretty hard to figure out which direction the motors are spinning, so here's a little trick that I learned. Take a piece of tape and put it off-center on the hub. This gives you a little bit of a flag that rotates around and should be easier to see. And if it's still spinning too fast, you can put your finger in the path of the tape and figure out whether it's hitting one side of your finger or the other. This will give you the direction of rotation. Like I said earlier in the video, you need to have the motor spinning in a very specific direction in order to cancel out the torque. In forward flight, you should have one propeller rotating clockwise and one rotating anti-clockwise. This makes it difficult to balance when you have three propellers, since the lift motor is going to be, I believe it's anti-clockwise. This can be addressed by tilting the main lift motors, the ones that tilt, and using that as a sort of trim. When I plugged in the radio, I figured out that my throttle channel was reversed. It's normal on the radio, but this plane wants it to be backwards. So I go into the menu, and I scroll down to channel reversing. I then select throttle, and click reverse. I then plug the plane back in, and secure the hatch. The plane lets you know it's ready when it puts the motors in vertical takeoff mode. The throttle channel then acted normally. I then test the tilt of the motors. You flick the switch, and after a delay, it puts the motors in a 45-degree angle, and then, eventually, after a second delay, puts them in forward flight mode. This is the thrust vectoring action I was mentioning earlier. You can see the motors tilting along as I use the ailerons. This makes the aircraft roll incredibly fast. You can see when it's in forward flight, the rear motor didn't kick on at all, and that's to be expected. It only kicks on when you're in vertical takeoff mode. This plane can only take off and land in vertical mode. The propellers are too high, and you'd clip them on the grass if you came in airplane mode. You could solve this by putting landing gear on the aircraft. However, that would make an already overweight aircraft even heavier, and provide a lot of drag, which is not good. This thing burns through batteries quite a bit. As you can see, when I flick into forward flight mode, it has an automated sequence that smoothly transitions the plane from helicopter mode into forward flight mode. This is pretty neat. They did a really good job programming the flight controller, and it took next to no brains to set it up. As you can see, this is how the aircraft changes orientation in helicopter mode. It actually tilts two of the rotors back and forth, and it only activates the elevon control surfaces when it's in either transition mode or forward flight mode, and it disables them in multi-rotor mode. I then replaced the propellers and made sure to use a screwdriver through the prop adapter to tighten them down. You always want to make sure that they are nice and tight, otherwise they will fall off and you will lose your aircraft. This is not an aircraft that can afford to lose a propeller. I then got very excited to test out the aircraft, and unfortunately it was raining, so I had to do a hover test in my bedroom. It was quite nerve-wracking, and there was definitely not enough space. I test the control surfaces before I take off. I also should note that I had to reverse all of the channels except for the auxiliary ones. So throttle, rudder, aileron, and elevator had to be reversed on this. Otherwise everything would have been backwards. It was a really weird encounter. I've only ever had to reverse one or two of the channels, not all four of them. But hey, this is a pretty special aircraft with some advanced programming, so I'm not surprised that there needed to be some adjustments made in the software. As you can see here, I'm pretty timid getting it up. I give it a little bit of throttle, and it has a ton of rudder. So I trim out the rudder, and it turns out I was doing it all wrong. You need to actually just take off before you can actually determine whether it has trim issues or not. While it's just sitting here on the ground, it's not really a good indication of how it would fly. So I actually undid that trim that I put in, because you can see it's starting to rotate as it gets off the ground. I then tried again. I straightened out and just gave it a little bit more gas. You can see it is wildly unstable here. I forgot to put the expo, which stands for exponential rates, which is when you move the stick a certain amount in the center, and it will go a certain amount, but then as you move the stick further away, it's not a linear progression, it's an exponential progression in the control surface deflection. There's a lot of videos that explain it much better than that, but basically the line goes curvy instead of straight, and that makes it easier to control when you're not going full left or right. It just needs smoother inputs. So that helped to explain why it was a little bit twitchy. However, it also was in the ground effect. If you don't know what the ground effect is, it's when the propellers are in their own turbulence from the air that's being deflected off the ground. This makes for a fairly unstable and unpredictable situation. You can see that the higher I go, the more stable it actually gets. And this is because it's not getting blown around by its own wind. I start getting a bit better with the controls. Oh, that's awesome. That is awesome.